So we're in the meditation, we're resting in our essence or what we are, letting go of all the thoughts about who we think we are. And really the meditation is all about doing this again and again. And every time we dip below the definitions in this way, we can settle into our true essence. That inner silence itself is the access point to our true essence. So this this talk, it started out being called Grief and Non-Duality. And what the fear of harm to loved ones is often the last piece of the self to fall away. And we've had actually questions from different people in this group about that, saying, we're letting go of attachments, but what about my children? That's a question that I often get. So we can no longer identify with a vast array of mental states that might arise, but the ego it tends to poke to the surface with regards to the fears around our loved ones, and perhaps in particular our children. So grief, sadness due to the loss of a loved one, or a loved one facing some difficulty or facing some suffering, is often the hardest state to allow and embrace. Even when nothing's happened to our loved ones, we can create suffering in our minds, right? We've probably all been there. We can imagine something that might happen, and that can create suffering. So as I've often said in the past, the degree to which we are attached is directly correlated to the depth of our suffering. So if we're attached in a very deep way to our loved ones, then of course we will suffer as a result. We can really see this directly. So I found myself this week relating to the last vestige or last remnant of resistance. So our daughter, who's some of you might know is pregnant, was found to have what's called pre-eclampsia regarding her pregnancy. So this poses some danger to the mother, and I found this out several days ago. And it was amazing to watch the ego grab a hold of this and proliferate with fear. It produced all kinds of thoughts that I haven't seen in some time. It was as if the ego saw an opportunity to grab a hold of this event and construct in fear, and in the process really rebuild itself. It almost felt like the ego was kind of trying to reconstitute itself. It had to feel, what came up is a feeling of a kind of a chess game with myself, with the ego doing all that it can to avoid being checkmated, trying to reconstitute itself. So there's this thing that's that's letting go. Let's call this the spiritual impulse, that deep aspiration for the truth, right? That yearning that's within us. So there's this thing that's trying to let go based on the spiritual impulse, and at the same time, there's this thing that's trying to hold on and reconstitute itself, and we'll call this the ego. And so I saw really firsthand how the ego thrives on fear and how it had found the perfect vehicle for it. I really saw firsthand how the ego can shape-shift to revive itself. And I think I called the talk Grief. When I was writing the talk, that's what it felt like. And it wasn't until as I sat with it and investigated it, that I saw that behind this was actually the fear being brought up by the egoic mind. Yeah. So whenever hardship or loss happens to our loved ones, the ego will experiences this as a very negative event. Right? It'll chime in with, this shouldn't have happened. Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? This, and you can see this as simply the ego trying to rebuild or reconstitute itself. So the ego drawing on our deepest fears, which often revolve around our loved ones, to rebuild itself. So when we recognize it for what it is, the ego is left with nowhere to go. We just recognize it. So I spent a day in, just feeling into this grief, this sadness. I didn't really know what this preeclampsia was. So but I sat with that grief, and then I saw below it this fear. And then when I saw it, when I recognized it for what it was, the ego was really left with nowhere to go. And it could then be experienced as grace rather than distress. So it's essential to recognize that this activity of the mind and mental states is the ego's attempt to kind of regain its footing and assert its identity. So it's the ego tapping into our deepest fears in order to reconstruct itself. So I came away actually with a realization, I guess a realization that I'd like to share, and I think that is really the place where the last remnants of the ego hides out. Right? So I think there's a valuable teaching in that to be alert to that, as possibly you could possibly have a similar unfolding where that is the last remnant or vestige of the ego. So it could feel like the ego is fallen away completely, right? Reactivity is fallen away. And then when something like that happens, of course, you go, oh, wow, there's something there. Really kind of just step back and watch the show, watch the game for what it was. And I could also see that unresisted, it was actually grace. It was only felt as distress when it was resisted. So unresisted, it was experienced as grace, not experienced as any fear or grief anymore. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. Doesn't mean that there isn't concern. It simply means that when grief is not resisted, it reveals itself as grace. It's a deep grace because it's the last vestige of the ego falling away. And our true nature of loving compassion revealing itself. So we see this again and again, and we think that the ego has largely fallen away, but the ego is, as Adyashanti says, it's a shapeshifter, so it sometimes reconstitutes itself in many different ways. So we're just being aware of the process for what it is. And when we're aware of it in this way, the ego is kind of left without any footing, without any solid foundation. And in that moment, instead of succumbing to distress or denial, we can shift our perspective and embrace the experience as a grace. And once I was able to kind of embrace it in this way, I reached out to friends. And I was amazed at how many of my male friends had the same experience with a partner or a daughter or a daughter-in-law. And they were able to share what their experience with it was. So before dragon boating, picture a group of guys on a men's dragon boat team talking about preeclampsia and what it's like to live with it and through it. So there was a deep grace in that as well. So we're understanding the ego, understanding its motives, seeing through its illusions. We can open up to a state of allowing, of grace. So it allows us to transcend the distressing aspects of a situation and find a deeper sense of peace and acceptance, of love. And we will likely not see it as a grace in the moment that it's happening. The moment that it was happening, all that was welling up was the ego reconstituting itself as fear. So in the moment, it was not experienced as a grace. It will likely not be for many of us. It's definitely too much to ask of the ego. The ego will not see it this way. But at some later time, particularly if we have a practice of letting go and allowing, that even a tragic event or a potentially tragic event can take us deeper into the essence of who we are beyond all form. And we really feel like another piece of the ego has fallen away. Something's been removed from us that we thought was us, but it's ultimately a fiction. So as I pondered this some more, of course, I come up with some teaching ideas, ways to convey this. I came up with 3 questions that we can pose when this kind of thing happens. And the first question is, what is our deepest aspiration or our most important thing? I know I keep coming back to this. If it's awakening and non-resistance to all experience, then even allowing this kind of intense fear or grief becomes possible. It only becomes possible if we have that truth or awakening as our most important thing. Otherwise, the courage to face it simply doesn't really arise. And the second thing we can ask ourselves is, do we want to deny any experience at all? Since everything, all experiences are all simply expressions of the divine or truth. So resistance, put more practically, resistance of anything simply creates more suffering. And third, we know that the opposite of whatever appears is contained in the experience. And I want to talk about this some more. The opposite of whatever appears is contained in the experience. For example, deep love is contained within intense grief. So from observing our direct experience, we can see that denying or resisting this kind of fear or grief is also a denial of love. So in the last little bit time here, let's unpack that third question some more. I've addressed the first 2 in other talks. When we view this kind of fear, this grief solely through the lens of the egoic mind, they appear as devoid of love, right? Instead, they appear as a collection of negative emotions characterized by sadness and pain. It feels like suffering to the ego. And in this perspective, it can be challenging to recognize any positive aspects of the fear or grief. But when there's an opening, a moment of total openness to it, we glimpse or see it as a radiant expression of love. If we allow ourselves to enter a state of total openness, a real transformation can occur. There's a complete surrender to the fear or the grief. We catch glimpses in that moment that reveal itself as truth, as the divine. So we perceive it as something much more profound and multifaceted than mere pain and suffering. So in this kind of expanded perception, we come to understand that it is, in essence, it's not separate from love. It becomes apparent that love permeates the fabric of this fear and this grief, even though it may not be immediately apparent, especially when it's actually happening. There's something there that's greater than ourselves, greater than the experience. So it's through this lens of total openness that we can appreciate the divine or the grace of it. And we can navigate the depths of these types of emotions with a sense of acceptance and grace. So it transforms the experience from one of being a kind of negative mind state or negative emotion, painful emotion, to one that holds actually the potential for healing and growth and actually ultimately a connection with our true nature. So we begin to see that within every experience we'll always find the opposite. This is kind of the crucial understanding that I'm trying to get across in this third question, is understanding that there's always the opposite within every experience. So when we open to this grief, this fear, we also experience a deep heart opening and an incredible love. As the ancient Sufis say, when the ego weeps for what it has lost, spirit rejoices for what it has found. When the ego weeps for what it has lost, spirit rejoices for what it has found. And of course, the grief and the fear comes and goes. It's impermanent, transitory, insubstantial. But our deepest nature remains constant. And that's what we're connecting with when we open to our direct experience. I found a quote in the Bible. I don't often quote the Bible here, but I'm quoting from Matthew 7:24. Everyone who listens to these words of mine and does them will be like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew, kind of like today, and beat against the house, but it did not collapse. It had been set solidly on rock. And everyone who listens to these words of mine but does not do them will be like a fool who builds his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against the house, and it collapsed and was completely ruined. So the house is you. And that's attributed to Jesus, that quote. The house is you, and the floods and rain symbolize the difficulties and adversity that we encounter in life. And when I read that, what resonated was when we dig deep enough and discover our essential nature, where there's a solid foundation. When we live on the superficial level of conceptual thinking in the egoic mind, then adversity will be experienced as intensely distressing. So when we dig deep and build the foundation on rock, which symbolizes our essential nature, we are resilient and we don't collapse or feel ruined, not blown over by the difficulties. When we live at the superficial level within the egoic mind, believing all the thoughts that it produces, the house is built on sand, then we live in a constant state of turmoil and fear. So we can always ask the question, have we built our house on sand, or have we dug deep and built it on the rock? And when we dig deep, we find the foundation within ourselves and we're free from the fear.